So anything you.
Just a mess out.
Yes, for the appropriations here.
No.
So,
We've got to put that away.
why?
We've got to put it away. We're not.
No.
But the big thing though is no whining. Like
Yes.
no whining. Yes.
No
Yeah.
head, right, fingers out.
Want to,
Sweet.
Main thing is no whining, you know?
And two, that.
There, you get it back. You should just have that one.
What this one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Gotta sit quiet, okay?
Okay.
Yeah, we won't hear, and no talking, yeah?
What are people saying?
We can set it like up here.
Well, you're gonna, well, maybe we'll stay back here while you give your presentation and then we'll come with the panel then.
About him.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe at the end.
I haven't even had a chance to ask any of you if you like the book, but I guess I'll find out. I do like 2 minutes. Be a great way to find out that you.
People get some from other shows. Sounds like it's from art.
Yeah. The last resort.
I mean,
So that's not.
Right.
yeah, 100%.
It's because
It's a tennis day.
it's
Yeah.
being mixture.
Nothing you can do is good.
What this page, right?
It's like, yeah, you can't see the display backwards. And then the other thing, how can we do it so that what we're sharing is not the main thing on the screen?
What do you want them to see?
See people who are here, like on the screen.
Okay.
There, right? That. Yeah, maybe that's better. Actually,
This one?
this is always.
Oh, and turn on the camera. I was like, so you'll see this on this
Yes.
side.
Okay, that's fine.
And can you? Camera?
Yeah.
It's a great phrase because they can. So busy.
Camera.
Your administrative work. Just gotta get it done right. But the funny thing is, it is administrative.
Oh, look at that one.
Out there.
It's not really sure sounds. Probably because of that.
So as to.
Chance to it's now.
My computer.
Max is Swahili.
You can just email them to me, I can share my screen.
Original music.
It works. I'll try to sign in.
No, that's like file right.
Yeah.
It's like.
It's a keynote. presentation.
You have a.
So assume I do that.
Mombasa, we were looking to reach.
So what was that mean, the email is just the most fantastic stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Can they hear me now? Sorry to the online folks. We're just joining us apparently. Okay, let me back up for 1 second. Yeah, so in 20th century Mombasa, men's Arab taarab events and Hadrami men's wedding celebrations employed this pervasive mood of nostalgia to frame appropriations of sounds of other shores as poetic acts pregnant with meaning, acts intended to be considered, scrutinized, reflected upon in light of their hidden second reality. Now, to bring this back now to Indian taarab. Indian taarab also framed appropriations of sounds of other shores as poetic acts. But while the performances of Juma Balo and other Indian taarab singers certainly had a nostalgic component, there were also a number of practitioners of the genre who employed different pervasive moods, namely irony and playfulness, to create an awareness of a second reality. These Indian taarab clowns, as I call them, cultivated roguish personae inspired by the more comedic Bollywood playback singers. And I focus to a greater extent on them in the book because the ways in which these Indian taarab clowns, the ways in which they played with Indianness and its relationship to Swahiliness situated them very clearly as cultural critics as much as entertainers. And so I sort of wanted to work with that and dig into that and sort of work with them. Perhaps the most skilled Indian taarab clown was this guy, Musa Maruf, or famous Musa, who was active during the 1940s and 50s. Partly of Indian descent, Maruf could perform Qawwali-style melismas in his piercing tenor voice while accompanying himself on an Indian hand-pumped harmonium. His songs set Swahili poems to otherwise authentic-sounding Indian melodies, some of which were his own compositions rather than drawn from Bollywood. Though a native Swahili speaker, he sung in a very heavy Hindustani accent. Maruf's playful approach to vocal performance introduces layers of intertextuality that compel the listener, the enculturated listener, to reflect upon the fact of appropriation. It's always right out front in his work. Take, for example, his Mpenzi Wangu Kanitoka, and Then My Love Left Me, based on a song from the 1946 film Shah Jahan. In a nasal tenor reminiscent of Indian playback singer K.L. Seigel's performance of the source song, Maruf sings Moyo Wangu Mevunjika, literally, my heart is broken. The image comes directly from the source song, which he could understand, but it also recalls the Swahili expression Vunjika Moyo, which is generally translated as to be discouraged. So there's this wordplay there, and it's really for, it's really for those enculturated listeners who get what's going on there. It translates the concept of lost love into a Swahili context, but also plays with the fact that the idiom is different in Swahili. And at the same time, Maruf's accent, which turns Wangu into Wangul, makes it impossible to forget that this is Swahili poetry inflected with Hindi, all wrapped up in an Indian voice emanating from an Indian Swahili mouth. Of the many stylistic paths that Swahili taarab has taken since the turn of the 20th century in the various urban centers of the Swahili coast, all have involved influences from beyond the African continent. But taarab performed and recorded in Mombasa during the 20th century featured much more dramatic adoptions of Indian and Arab styles. So Indian taarab, Arab taarab, entire subgenres grounded in appropriation. So it was so much so that the late eminent historian and Mombasa native Ali A. Mazrui once described the history of Mombasan Swahili music as a twofold orientalization. In addition to being especially intensive, transoceanic appropriation in Mombasan Swahili music during the 20th century was special for its reflexive focus on appropriation itself, or this is the argument that I developed. I contend that the gesture of appropriation at the heart of Indian taarab and Arab taarab held a special allure for Swahili-speaking Muslims in 20th century Mombasa because it enabled them to find pleasure in and gain new perspectives on their complicated social positioning in Kenya. From the beginning of the British colonial era in East Africa in the 1890s, Swahili-speaking Muslims of the East African coast have occupied ambiguous or contradictory positions within the dominant systems of ethnic classification. As an African population partly comprised of Arabs and Indian Ocean diasporans, they confounded the British colonial administration's efforts to categorize every colonial subject as either native or non-native. In Kenya, where Christians are the majority and tribe has been the prime mover of politics since the independence struggle, Swahili-speaking Muslims' efforts to achieve or maintain non-native status under colonial rule came to haunt them after independence, marking them as people who were, to quote historian Jeremy Prestolt, neither completely African nor, by extension, completely Kenyan. And this is especially true of Mombasa. The spatial configuration and attendant social choreography of Mombasa, a sprawling modern port city with an ancient Swahili stone town at its center, served to mark its Swahili-speaking Muslim residents as in-between and ambiguous, neither foreign nor local, neither Arab nor African, but somehow all of these things at once. Sounds of Other Shores uses a combination of oral history, interpretive ethnography, and close analyses of musical performances to trace practices of transoceanic musical appropriation in Mombasa over a span of around 7 decades, from the early recorded Swahili taarab of the interwar years to the reemergence of transoceanic appropriation in the early experiments in Swahili hip-hop at the turn of the 21st century. And what I'm doing throughout is actually trying to explore this problematic with those musicians and audiences as they were using transoceanic appropriation as a way of reflecting on this ambiguous positioning. One of my main tasks, or the task I set for myself, is to engage in analyses of what I describe as a musical poetics of identity. And by this, I mean a sonorous practice of questioning and commenting on relations of self and other, generally taking place at the level of style, which is to say in the patterning of sonic gestures that lends a felt coherence to a musical composition or performance. My approach to musical poetics draws inspiration from the work of Russian thinker and literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin. In particular, I make use of Bakhtin's concept of stylization, which he defines as an artistic representation of a style that's neither simply imitation nor caricature, but something in between, a self-conscious form of mimesis that sets up a productive tension, a tension between stylizer and stylized, between self and other. So all of the recorded works that I analyze in the book are available on the Companion website, and they're also archived along with hundreds of other recordings that I collected during my fieldwork in a collection that's under the name of the Andrew Eisenberg Collection of East African Commercial Sound Recordings in the New York University Abu Dhabi Library. It's clear from the existence of these websites that sound recordings are highly mobile and easily decontextualized and recontextualized. But in analyzing recorded performances in Sounds of Other Shores, I attend to the actual spaces and times in which they circulated and sounded in their moments. By taking an ear to the special forms of what Bakhtin would call dialogic relationality, special forms that aren't actually present so much in literature, namely those forms related to how musical expressions reverberate and resonate within and between human subjects and physical spaces. And I bring this dimension into my analysis, both through, first of all, an historiographical analysis of local media. So there's a lot of media history in there. And then ethnographic analyses of performances that attend closely to spatial production and placemaking. So the literal resonances, so I attend to the literal resonances of these appropriations. And the literal resonances of transoceanic musical appropriation in the physical spaces of Mombasa are especially relevant, I argue, because Swahili identity on the Kenyan coast is traditionally conceptualized in relation to lived space-time. So this, the resonances of these sounds, these appropriated sounds, became or served as a really sort of good thing to think about and think with for musicians and audiences, because space is such an important aspect of how identity is understood. Coastal Swahili speakers often approach ideas of what it means to be Swahili through this spatial notion of Uswahili. And the word may be glossed as Swahiliness or Swahili culture. It can work either way. However, it always carries that spatial connotation. And in discourses of ethnic identification, coastal Swahili speakers make use of this conflation of identity and space to express what I call an ethnic schema. And I name this Swahili space. And the Swahili space schema posits Swahili ethnicity as a territory that individuals and communities dwell within or move into or out of. And this harmonizes with lived experience on the Swahili coast, where being or becoming Swahili has always implied existing within or entering into a specific context, a cultural and moral context, and that context being what we'd call the Swahili town. Ultimately, Sounds of Other Shores is a work that tries to listen to and listen with Swahili-speaking Muslim musicians and audiences in 20th century Mombasa as they explore the resonances and reverberations of Swahili space through these transoceanic appropriations. I'm going to leave my remarks here, and we're going to get some comments from, I don't know what's happening next, but something will happen. Thank you. You want me to sit here? What do we do with this? You want me to stop sharing this?
So everybody, we leave it, like we all go through here.
But we're,
Online.
can we go to that?
Yes, so you are the one controlling it.
Oh, I stopped sharing.
Yeah. So the word is people can just come up here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much, Andrew. Maybe we can clap again. Asante sana. That was just amazing. So we'll have 3 speakers. I'll start because I'm saying very little, and then we'll have music scholars, Professor Angela Impe and Professor. My Hill department, Ilana Webster Cook, speak after me. So I was going to quickly talk about the Swahiliness that I found in the text, so I thought I would start by just quickly giving you a geographical sort of like background about the people of East Africa, of the coast. And in terms of taarab, which is muziki wa Swahili music. So generally, the East African Swahili coast and the East African mainland have historically been viewed as mutually exclusive, right? These are dichotomous spaces where the coast is different. And I think some of us, those of us who are Swahili scholars, have heard of, have read Pat Kaplan, who writes an article about the coast being actually different. And I think this is what Andrew does really well in showing in this book. So, I mean, okay, thinking of Mombasa, right away you think of movements that have taken place there. Like, for example, Pwani si Kenya, which is the coast is not Kenya. Although in 2021, we had the Nation newspaper in Kenya saying that that idea is an illusion. We can discuss this later if you're interested. But I mean, scholars and the Swahili people from the coast themselves do see or do conceptualize the coast as being totally different from the mainland, and that there is a process of construction of the coast, especially in terms of music in this book, that is okay.
Yes,
Okay, that is done really well. I really enjoyed seeing the Swahiliness come through. Interestingly for me, the Swahiliness that I see in this book is not the Swahiliness that I learned at school. So I went to school in the Tanzania. So I started school in the Tanzania of mid-1980s. And at the time, we defined the Swahili as anybody who spoke Swahili. As long as you spoke Swahili, you were Swahili. The whole idea of the coast was not something that we learned at school. So this was very much because of should we say, like the nationalization, I mean, sort of like the national identity that was going on in Tanzania. Yeah, Okay. It is only when I went outside, when I came to Europe and elsewhere, that I now sort of like conceptualized a Swahili as being someone who was not a Swahili just because he spoke the language. There was more to this than just the language. And Andrew's book really sort of like references this paradox of being Swahili, where the same individual can be considered African in one context, Arab in another, and Swahili in a third. And interestingly for me now, also Indian possibly in a fourth, which I think, Andrew, this is really, I had never heard of Indian taarab until I read this book. So this, I mean, we can probably discuss this this later. I mean, definitely you can see through Andrew's book that the Swahili not possess a clear identity. It's very fluid, but it seems this fluidity is expanded through Andrew's book. So I think what it does really is that it expands the Indian Ocean as a space that is now inspiring African studies. And I think you also talk about the Indian Ocean as method in your book throughout the book, or suggesting that we need to have a view of Africa, not as a continent in isolation, but rather one that is economically, culturally, linguistically connected to networks that have gone on for centuries. I think I don't need to go through this with you, but we do know that we had trade into East Africa from 2 centuries before Christ, right? Whereas Islam, for instance, arrives in the 8th century. So I mean, these networks have gone on for a very, very long time. What was I gonna say? Okay, thinking of language, which is what I'm supposed to be talking about today, I thought there were 3 aspects that I saw really well presented in the book. The first one is that taarab songs are generally songs about love. And that's this, to me, this is a fact. I mean, growing up, I began to appreciate taarab as I went to weddings. I mean, my mother would play taarab at home, but really the appreciation of them comes from going to weddings and having a live singer performing, as opposed to having it at home. So when I was young, I think I would rather buy Milli Vanilli than just to give you the fakeness that I mean, as opposed to, yeah. So very much reading Andrew's book, I felt very nostalgic. I felt very nostalgic of the Swahiliness that I came to understand later, which is portrayed really well in the book. The second thing that I saw in terms of language is the mafumbo that he explores. So, okay, mafumbo can be, these are like, it's not really riddles or paradoxes. It's a way of saying things in an ambiguous way. And so Andrew writes that, what is it? So he says that this is the style of mafumbo, is the style of early 20th century understanding of deeper meaning in taarab, right? And that broadly now it is seen as the exploiting of the power of ambiguity. And he explores this rivalry that went on between Balo and Maulidi, who had, and I absolutely love this, so I have to cite this, who had these salacious insult songs continually broadcasted between their 2 spots in Mombasa, right? What's that? There you are, exactly, yes, yeah. And sort of like, so this to and fro went on for a while, until I think in the end, somebody from the government had to come and stop it. And so then very much you see the second sort of like language aspect here, where it is the competition, it is the language, it is the competitive language between these 2 these 2 sides that make taarab what it is. You want to go to listen to taarab so you can hear the 2 sides of whatever the song is. And then the last one, which was very interesting for me, which I think Ilana can talk about a lot better, was the hip hop influence on taarab. It's something I think I need to explore more, and I'm very intrigued to know more about. But it seems there's sort of like influences of zouk and sukus and hip hop into taarab as well. And the last thing I want to talk about is I was very excited to read about the role of Sauti ya Mvita, the Mvita Radio Mombasa, because this is a radio that was very popular in the 1950s, not just in Mombasa, but also Zanzibar. So my grandmother grew up with Sauti ya Mvita, and she would listen to Sauti ya Mvita all the way from Zanzibar, as opposed to other radios, maybe in her own, like Radio Unguja, for instance. So, but it seems that the Sauti ya Mvita was able to cross this sort of like ethnic territorial space through music, and I really enjoyed reading that. Lastly, I think that Endu, you've developed a new line of inquiry through this understanding of Indian taarab. Because for me, I had never connected taarab with Indianness. But then having listened to Are Baba Pakistani, Hindustani earlier, I thought, oh my God, that's actually there, but I just never saw this. Yeah, thank you very much. Can I, thank you. Can I quickly invite Ilana?
Thank you so much, Ida, for organizing this and for bringing Andy over from multiple other shores. Yes. Great, everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Ilana Webster-Hogan. I'm a longtime colleague of Dr. Andy Eisenberg's. I'm a fellow ethnomusicologist. I'm based here at SOAS and currently head of the School of Languages, Cultures, and Linguistics, in which African Studies is based. And my first book was about Ethiopian popular music, so I'm delighted to be able to share my thoughts in this forum. As a teacher who trains students to read critically and efficiently, I'm delighted by the publication of Sounds of Other Shores as a wonderful gift for the classroom. I will be assigning it often. I had it on my syllabus for an African music class last term that I didn't wind up teaching. Lizzie did. Thank you, Lizzie. But when I'm going to use it as a teaching tool, we'll start with the title and the book cover because they have the remarkable capacity to upend expectations and stereotypes. We can look at the cover a little bit. I'll hold it up. Great. Kenya, Swahili. For students who are encountering ethnomusicology for the first time, these are words that don't typically conjure images of Arab popular media or Hindi film music. And the image of Zayn with his oud on the cover, along with all of this other shores business, summarizes the book's arguments about as succinctly as possible. Andy Eisenberg has crystallized a remarkably complex history and argument into these few words and its accompanying image. So I'll spend a few brief minutes describing the way that he spins out that complex argument, and afterwards I will evaluate the argument, in my opinion. As early as the introduction, on page 1, in fact, Eisenberg boldly outlines this study as what he calls a genealogy of music as a space of ethnic subject formation in an African-Indian Ocean nexus. This genealogy focuses on the impact of Indian and multiple Arabic styles on cosmopolitan listeners and performers in Kenya's Swahili port city. Calling it what he calls a study of Swahili ethnogenesis on page 4, Eisenberg frames the paradoxes of Swahili subjectivity that the book unpacks, namely the in-between status occupied by Muslim citizens of an African city on the Indian Ocean. Within this frame, he describes Swahiliness as a domain shaped by the physical space of the old town and the creative mechanism of what he calls transoceanic musical appropriation. He then moves chronologically through a history of taarab in Mombasa. Chapter 1 describes the early days of taarab recording, particularly the work of Siti Binti Saad. He proposes that musical appropriation is a form of citational and reflexive practice, borrowing the term genre synecdoche that some of us in hip-hop studies use. A genre synecdoche, for those of you who don't do hip-hop studies, describes the use of a musical motive or technique serving for listeners as the entirety of the genre it represents. Bringing in recorded examples of dialogue, play, joking, and parody, he advances a theory of genre, borrowing from Bakhtin, in which musical style is self-conscious and somewhat DIY. This is an argument that I very much like and use a little bit in my book, Citizen Asmari, so I obviously accept the premise. Chapter 2 expands the discussion of taarab in the mid-20th century by engaging media criticism through analysis of Mombasa's radio station that Ida just mentioned, Sauti ya Mvita, and its contribution in the 1950s to the propagation of a reflexive approach to genre. The station cultivated utamaduni, the Swahili word for sophisticated urbanity, a mode of listening and appreciating that bears some resonance from Borgia's notion of distinction. Mobilizing the concept of acoustemology, again, for the non-ethnomusicologists here, that means sound as epistemology, Eisenberg frames an argument of utamaduni as acoustemology that branches off to Indian and Arab-influenced subgenres later. Chapter 3 introduces us to Indian taarab, a genre of music popularized between the 1930s and through the 60s and 70s, showcasing Swahili lyrics set to Hindi film music. There is a scholarship of this phenomenon stretching across the African continent, including in Ghana, which is certainly not part of the Indian Ocean sphere of influence. Indian taarab therefore fits broadly into a category known as Bollywood contrafacta, that's his term, and its popularity peaked in the post-war era in the mid-20th century, aided by the import of instruments like the harmonium. In the book's central 3 chapters of pulling apart the different influences on taarab, this chapter does the main work for our understanding the Indian element of Arab, Gulf, South Asian spheres of musical appropriation. Chapter 4 is about wedding music, and particularly Yemen-influenced Hadrami material. This is Gulf-specific repertoire rather than reflecting Arabic aesthetics more broadly, and highlights the Arab world's own role in transoceanic appropriation. If we have time during the Q&A, I would really like to ask Andy how his last 10 years working and teaching in the Gulf impacted the development of this chapter. Relatively close proximity to Mombasa is an obvious perk for your work living in Abu Dhabi, but intimate engagement with Khaliji Gulf culture will have changed one's perspective too. Chapter 5 is sort of the aesthetic climax of the book, the chapter about Zain Labdin and Arab taarab. The chapter begins with a biography of the artist, with whom Eisenberg worked closely over many years, and includes an account of Zain's music education and a survey of his Arab musical idols like Farid al-Atrash, to his earliest recordings with Ben Mandelson, who happens to be sitting right there. Eisenberg engages a discussion of repertoire, outlining the different categories that Zain's work represented, including Egyptian Arabic maksum rhythms and Kuwaiti Saut influence, Latin American rumba and samba, and Swahili songs set to ngoma rhythms. Ultimately, this coalesces in a debate over whether Swahili is a hybrid product or whether Swahili represents an identity that is flexible. And Zain's style epitomizes the latter through what Eisenberg calls a musical poetics of ambiguity. You might need to read the whole book to appreciate the conclusion of that chapter, but Eisenberg brings in a Swahili term, vuma, that describes the roaring of the sea near the shore as a sound that does something in between resonating and reverberating, and he proposes that Arabic has that status in Swahili culture. Since the book moves chronologically, chapter 6 focuses on the 21st century, in which Indian and Arab variants of taarab are no longer widespread on the Swahili coast. Among other factors, he discusses the influence of Islamic reformism on public musical performance. As a scholar of sound, ritual, and urban space, this was a section that I inhaled. I particularly enjoyed the examination of the old town framed and perceived as a Swahili bulwark against the surrounding non-Muslim nation state, and the density of religious sound that permeates the so-called Islamic city. In this process, taarab, as it was performed through the 1970s, was supplanted on the one hand by modern taarab, a loose set of genres not always bearing much aesthetic resemblance to taarab, and a parallel phenomenon of the transformation of taarab into heritage. The heritageized version of taarab could be marketed together with Zanzibari taarab as world music, though stripped of its syncretic properties that had been at its core. Finally, chapter 7 describes a dynamic in which Swahili identities are excluded from what Eisenberg calls the representational strategies of an emerging national hip-hop aesthetic of urbanness. He describes how Nairobi dominates the national imagination, and the default strategies of mostly Christian purveyors of youth culture in Mombasa, cutting the Arab-Muslim component of Mombasa out through a mechanism of being in but not from Mombasa called Mombasani. There is the striking example of Samia, a video by Show Demo that draws on Orientalist fantasies of the Swahili coast that national audiences could recognize, of the juice stand that blasts Arabic pop music and frames itself as Dubai, imagery for glittering cosmopolitan urban development, and the now self-explanatory example of hip-hop taarab. Readers who know Eisenberg's work well will have been familiar with at least some of this material prior to reading the book, because a few chapters have been published as articles. As a reader, looking at those case studies afresh in the context of the broader argument, I was not bothered at all by that. And in fact, it was interesting to see these repertoires that I was already familiar with being repurposed as part of a broader argument. Seeing Gulf influence from Kuwaiti divers or Yemenis who migrated generations ago as distinctive from Egyptian media as different kinds of Arab influence, broadens out the discussions and brings the Arab world into the burgeoning field of Indian Ocean studies explicitly, helping to shift a discourse that overwhelmingly favors South and Southeast Asia. What I take away from this book is an understanding of the Indian Ocean as a sphere of influence that can come together in ways that can be sometimes discrete and other times hybridized. Music is a useful entry point into this knowledge because it is quite satisfying to see the result of an expert pulling apart individual influences, such as Hindi film music contrafacta or hip-hop beats downloaded in Scandinavia. So I hope that scholars from across Swahili studies will be patient with the musical analysis, and if they are, they will reap the benefits of the analysis. Thank you.
Thanks, Ilana. One of the challenges of being the last person in the room is that there may be a bit of repetition here, which I apologize in advance. But what do I need to do? Here, okay, that's good. Yeah. So I'm Angela Impey, Professor Emeritus of Ethnomusicology. I just finished up at SOAS in October of last year. I have been teaching a course on the Indian Ocean music for a number of years. I'm slightly sad that the book has come out just too late to be used as a core reading, as Ilana was suggesting, but we did use your articles in great quantities though. So I first of all just to thank you for being invited to comment on the book. I know that I'm amongst many people who've been eagerly awaiting this publication for quite some time. And personally, I think I've been looking forward to this book since about 2005, when we first met in Zanzibar. Ben and I, my husband there, Ben Mandelson, and I were
It was 2010.
Was it 2010? I meant to ask you that just before. Okay, 2010, let's give you 5 years later. But nonetheless, ever since that time, I've really been so excited about seeing what comes out of the research. Andy was on leave from doing his dissertation research in Mombasa at the time. So just thinking about how I wanted to sort of approach this presentation today, I was reminded of that encounter. And I'm surprised by how many of the memories I had of the details of his work as he recounted it then remain foremost in this book. So those memories I'll just be thinking of here. First of all, it's Andy's framing of Mombasa and taarab as profoundly human experience, and the recognition that understanding the subtle interiorities of this historically multiply complex and dynamic genre was dependent very much on the establishment of meaningful relationships in the field. He regaled us with many stories about hanging out with musicians and cultural spokespeople in homes and public coffee houses, and most significant amongst them being the distinguished oud player and your teacher, I believe, was Zain Lipton, whose presence is felt throughout the book. He's on the cover and has a chapter 5 dedicated to him. So it's not surprising that the book is framed as humanistic music anthropology, made evident through its close analysis of individual creativity as a form of critical reflective dialogue and identity formation. The second thing that I remember being really impressed by was that being in Zanzibar, of course, there was a great deal of discussion about Zanzibar taarab, and aware of how much research was being done on that particular genre. Which at that time was also kind of experiencing something of a kind of resurgence, if you like. But despite the many regional intersections between Zanzibar and the Kenyan coastal traditions, Andy's focus on Mombasa and taarab attended to a critical gap in taarab scholarship, and significantly to those influences on Swahili culture that stood outside the elite Arab narrative. So for me, attention to, and this has come up now quite a lot, attention given to this book, to the Indianness in Mombasa and taarab, is a particularly innovative and important and indeed visceral dimension of this study, and significantly expanding our understanding of these transoceanic circulations and their influence on the curation of distinct vernacular Swahili identities and cultural imaginaries. The other thing I remember was being slightly awestruck by the challenges that Andy had taken on in navigating research that moved across so many languages. Swahili and its coastal dialects, Arabic, Hindi, he throws in a bit of Persian, Urdu, Michikenda, Giriama. So clearly his understanding of Mombasa and taarab depended on meticulous analysis of intertextual links and their stylistic manifestation in local scale systems, melodies, rhythms, and vocalities. And one of the notable features of the book, as I see it, is a sophisticated analysis of text and style, and the music is not in a lot of taarab literature of this kind of detailed analysis, particularly on the music and style. Always corroborated by close examination of particular songs or consideration of a comparative experimentation of individual performers, each with their own cultural influences and imaginative proclivities. So finally, I remember Andy's excitement at the discovery of certain record collections, some private and some public, which encouraged him to then go on to research what was largely at that stage an undocumented history of the phonographic industry of the Swahili coast, its local resonances, regional influences, and its global economic reach. So by focusing on early recordings from the 1930s to the decline of Mombasa and taarab at the turn of the 21st century, the book captures a significant moment in the change in taarab as it moves away from its Arabic-based orchestral performance associated with the Omani elite to a subaltern style thoroughly embedded in Swahili poetics. And here I was going to mention the archive that you've spoken about already, which is a really valuable accompaniment to the book. And those of us who write books about music often don't actually go to all of that trouble to actually to make the music available. So what is significant about the archive, I think, is that it comprises sound files and metadata of hundreds of commercial recordings that were produced specifically for East African audiences and for Arab and African audiences of the Swahili coast in particular. So overall, in remembering that encounter, I remember thinking this was particularly complex research for which only meticulous, methodical, and slow percolating research could do justice. So we forgive you for that. Yeah. And certainly the book does not disappoint. So I just want to get a couple of general comments and to kind of step back a little bit. So it goes without saying that Sounds of Other Shores is a welcome addition to a burgeoning world of Indian Ocean studies. It joins the relatively recent upsurge in research about the region, which has been supported by multidisciplinary research centers, international conferences, podcasts, and publications. It also attracts a really diverse group of scholars from many different disciplines. So as noted by Julia Bile and Jim Sykes in their 2020 review article, Ethnomusicology of the Indian Ocean, this transoceanic domain offers rich possibilities for working beyond the template of the nation state and of area studies. It is space in and through which to interrogate historical gaps, encouraging researchers to write with empire at a distance, to subvert Eurocentric narratives, and to just explore the space as paradigmatic of widely connected human relations. Meg Samuelson has noted that the East African littoral has always been portrayed through a unique and particular coastal sensorium, the smell of the sea, the salt, the wind, and storms. So I would think it would be reasonable to suggest that among the senses, the auditory has not been extensively explored. So Sounds of Other Shores provides a rich testimony to how music and sound in general holds a special place in the reconstruction of historical cross-currents. The book speaks volumes to how listening to and performing music brings the Indian Ocean into being, not only its borders and networks, but also its vivid peopled and storied world. I was reminded here of an argument made by the African historian Patrick Harries in trying to persuade historians of the validity of song and sound and music as historical evidence. When he writes, songs present a localized and subjective view of events and do not adhere to the irreplaceable concrete reality of history. Their richness and strength lie in the perception of the past that is not dominated by the oral history of the dominant lineage or the written history of the literate. Songs allow the historian to go beneath the actions and events of the past and to acquire an understanding of the intellectual and emotional constructs that generate change. And this claim certainly speaks to the aims and achievements of this book. So just very briefly, as a musical ethnography, it reveals a range of other stories, displacing the more commonplace approach to historical reconstruction, which has taken place through an analysis of traces and retentions, and focusing instead on human creativity and the senses in the fashioning of self, place, and community. The book adopts the concept of epistemology, as Ilana was suggesting, as its analytical underpinning, emphasizing local epistemologies of sound to argue for intentionality in the fashioning of musical form. So musical systems, Andy argues, are not random hybrids of musical practices that have been washed ashore over time, but are instead self-consciously appropriated and reworked towards the curation of an essentially Swahili identity. And this is also something that's really new in the scholarship, I would suggest. This focus on intentional construction of an internalized stylization and the attendant structures of feeling brought about by certain sounds, melodies, instruments, and particularly these vocalic qualities, is both novel contribution to Swahili taarab historiography and supports an understanding of boundaries within the context of these ever-shifting hybrid spaces as not so much physical as they are sensible or of the senses. So I have a few little gaps. I think we were always kind of meant to, as academics, to pull these out. Some of this, and I don't take that this is more to do with maybe if there's a second part to the study. One is just the idea of audience reception. In the Zanzibari taarab scholarship, there's a great deal of information about the musical culture clubs and what goes on in these clubs. There's a lot about gender interaction. There's a lot about the kind of embodied, stylized interactions between the audience, particularly the women and the musicians, and how all of this actually really that's important construction in the idea of local values, this idea of veiled meanings or veiled commentary, and also in the construction of community. So I would have loved to have seen a little bit more of that aspect of the kind of live performance, as you mentioned, the weddings and that. And the second maybe, and this is something that comes up in Indian Ocean studies a lot, and that is the African coast is often described as a hinge, not wholly looking outward, but absorbing also from the hinterland. And I would have loved to have heard a little bit more about the Michikenda and Giriama influences, the African influences in the making of that Swahili sound. So just two little things for the next thing. And then I'm going to just end up here also to say I was delighted to see the chapter on the Hadrami, on the Yemeni influence. You mentioned kind of the way in which the book has kind of expanded our spread of understanding of taarab. I think further, not for you, but I was going to throw this out also as something that, having stepped back from the Mombasa research, having lived in the Gulf for many years now, and no doubt been part of many conversations about Indian Ocean music more broadly, is to invite the study of more of the Yemeni influence on taarab as a way of kind of perhaps looking deeper into the long durée of these interactions, and wondering what that study might do for our understanding of Indian Ocean taarab. So thank you so much. Oh, I did forget to say something very important, is beautiful writing. I think everybody would understand. It's an absolute pleasure to read. Master craftsman as a writer, and it's always something that stands out for me. Solid scholarship, beautifully theorized, lots and lots of wonderful ethnographic detail, and beautifully crafted. So thank you for that.
Yeah. We have to find a solution with the Zoom now.
No, just leave it. You send that. You send that. You can see it.
Should we? I mean, should I turn? I guess I have to come here. Yeah. Yeah. Sorry. Huh?
Could do that.
Oh, this desk here.
Well, it's stretched up for us.
But
Will the wire
and
stretch?
do we need this still? Yeah, we do, right? No, we don't.
You only need it for your slides, right?
Yeah. It'll just be Zoom then, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Or we can all just try not to trip over the wire. Let's just not trip over the wire.
Oh, while we're here, you can buy a book.
Totally, totally.
It is £15. Go check on Amazon and see how much they are. 15. 15 today. Tomorrow, back to original price. So.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Having him. And you want to sit in?
Yeah, go on. Yeah. You.
Me? You.
You're about to talk about
Say some stuff.
Yeah, say some stuff. Yes. You might want to, yeah, you might want to go again.
It doesn't need to be plugged in still. I guess it doesn't. Right? No. Yeah, thank you for these close readings and I mean, beautiful and generous comments. Yeah, I guess there was a specific question about how being at NYU Abu Dhabi and being in Abu Dhabi for the past decade now, how that shaped this work. And I think the answer is profoundly. And in fact, so this work was sort of on the back burner a bit. Georgie Bourne, who just left, I got on a European Research Council project with her shortly after I finished my dissertation. This book is not a revision of the dissertation, but it's based on the same research, and some bits and pieces of the dissertation made it into the book in heavily revised form. So it sort of was percolating in the background as I was doing a lot of research in Nairobi. And that shaped the book too in ways that maybe, I mean, are really clear to me, but maybe really subtle when you read the book. You know, my experience of doing research in Nairobi around this time. So when I came back to this work, well, I was sort of drawn back to it in the sense that the book needed to be written, but also I was in Abu Dhabi and having quite a lot of really fruitful interactions and conversations with scholars of the Khalij. And there's really sort of not, I mean, there still is kind of a kind of dearth of really in-depth scholarship on music in that region, especially in English and French, but even in Arabic, there's still a lot more to be done. But I got to know scholars working on Yemen, of which there is, you know, a good deal of scholarship, and then Kuwaiti scholars, including one who's now become my junior colleague, Ghazi Amolefi. And so Ghazi and I having discussions about Kuwait and about, you know, I told him all about Zayn, who unfortunately passed away in 2016 before I had a chance to like bring him over there and hang out. But Zayn was quite obsessed with Kuwaiti salt music, Kuwaiti song. That was his, you know, his favorite music, and it was something that really he became enamored with in his childhood, because he remembered his father had a kind of, you know, salon, a maskani, where he would bring, because he worked as a clerk at the port, and he knew ship captains, and he made sure that the best Kuwaiti musicians were on board some of these ships, and they would come to his home, where his brother, Zayn's uncle, was probably the finest musician in Lamu at the time, and he wanted to learn from the Kuwaiti musicians. And it's understood that the Kuwaitis were the ones who brought the oud to the Swahili coast in the first place. Before that, the local lute was called the kibangala, which is very much like the Yemeni gambus. But by the time Zayn was, you know, growing up in the 1940s and experiencing these meetings between Kuwaiti musicians and Swahili musicians, there was the kibangala wasn't played anymore. It was hanging on he remembers it hanging on the wall of his father's living room. And when these Kuwaiti musicians and Swahili musicians were meeting, and this was really formative for him. Before he ever became a musician, before he ever picked up an instrument, he fell in love with Kuwaiti music. And so, and a lot of what he did, you know, it was sort of, he modeled himself on Kuwaiti musicians. He sort of, he also really took a lot from the the musicians of, the golden age of Cairo, and he also modeled himself on Farid al-Atrash, including like visually, like he would try to like dress like Farid, and because Farid was very suave and a ladies' man, and so he tried to be like Farid as well, and Farid was also a virtuoso oud player, but the Kuwaiti thing was always there. So Ghazi and I and other, I got to know Ahmed Al-Salhi, who has a PhD from King's College, I believe, who's now the director of the Opera House in Kuwait City. And Al-Salhi is someone who I've learned from as well. So it really kind of, I found interlocutors that I didn't have before to really delve deeper into the Yemeni aspect of this music. And, I really relied on people to listen to, and it's all there, sometimes you have to dig into the footnotes to see it, but I had a kind of brain trust of Yemeni musicians and scholars who could help me go through some of the stuff, could listen to Zayn's recordings and give me feedback on it. And that comes through there. So, but also Abu Dhabi, again, as part of the Indian Ocean world. And it's, so it wasn't just about getting to know more Yemeni and Kuwaiti musicians, but Indian Ocean studies is something that, is an, NYU Abu Dhabi is an obvious place for this. So there have been workshops and conferences where I've gotten to sort of present this work and have feedback. And just a week ago, or less than a week ago, I was engaged in a project which is a sort of follow-on from the book, an experiment essentially in art as scholarship, where I'm collaborating with a composer from NYU New York, Elizabeth Hoffman, who doesn't know the Indian Ocean world at all, but she's coming at it completely through me and through this idea of experimenting with voice. And so I ran a workshop just last week in Abu Dhabi. I brought together two Hindustani classical singers, Ghazi, who I mentioned, a Kuwaiti musician who's also an ethnomusicologist, and I brought two musicians from Mombasa, Barak Ali Haji, who's mentioned in chapter 6, and his wife, Monate Kibwana. And we came together for 4 days to, we chose 3 melodies that were existing melodies, one a Bollywood melody, one a Kuwaiti salt melody, and one traditional Swahili melody, which was actually composed by Mbarak, but based on like a traditional approach to Swahili and Ngoma. And we had 2 existing texts for the Indian and Arab melodies already. We had a Swahili text and Hindustani and Swahili and Arabic text. And then we had a Swahili text. And I brought these collaborators together, and the idea was to create a 3rd hybrid text for each of them, or a 2nd text for the traditional Swahili melody. I encouraged our Hindustani classical singers, because they're both from Bengal, to actually write something in Bengali for the traditional Swahili. And then to sort of combine these texts and have fun with that, and actually start singing in each other's languages. We had a lot of fun with it, and it was a great, just an incredible kind of moment, and it's something that I could only kind of imagine doing in Abu Dhabi. Our Hindustani classical singers were both based in Abu Dhabi. One is a professor of computer science at Zayed. He actually works in music information retrieval. And then Ghazi's there, and I was there. So we just, the only people who traveled were the 2 Swahili musicians. And we just got together and sort of saw how things flowed, and it was an incredible experience. That also brings me to like thinking about the book as an opening, even though it kind of a bit of a capstone on research, because I already have now a decade of research in another area. But I wanted to, and actually being in Abu Dhabi helps me keep thinking of it as an opening. And there's a lot more to be done. And I propose, coming back to Indian Ocean studies, I propose that this is an intervention, as Angela is saying, thinking about a humanistic musical anthropology or a humanistic anthropology. It doesn't have to be musical, but it's about expressive culture. Thinking about that as an approach to the Indian Ocean, because what I saw, and I was really excited about, Julia and Jim's book, which came out just like 6 months before mine, It's called Sounding the Indian Ocean. And there's an early version of one of these chapters in that book. So yeah, so it's, even though the books came out at the same time, that was a slightly earlier version. So they, they set, and that book won the Monsoon Award, the inaugural Monsoon Book Award. It's gotten a lot of recognition, and I think it deserves it. And I was excited about the way it was pushing an ethnomusicology of the Indian Ocean, and excited to be part of that. But I thought, like, and I think that my specific intervention there is to think about a humanistic anthropology, centered on creativity, centered on, creative agency, because so much of the material so much of the early kind of material on especially musicology of the Indian Ocean or ethnomusicology of the Indian Ocean, so much of it is like, let's find how these things came together. Let's retrace histories. Let's find where things come from, find the source of things. And it's understandable that that's there. And to the extent that that's a project that specific communities, especially subaltern communities, want to do, it should be done. But I thought that, understanding these, rather than finding, traces or finding, retentions, to think about it in like the Herskovitzian kind of vein, because that's where it was being inspired by a lot, by Melva Herskovitz's work in the Black Atlantic. Rather than that, I said, why don't we actually look at the kind of much later work on the Black Atlantic, which is focusing on creative agency and how people are, as creators and audiences are engaging with these echoes or retentions in very conscious ways, in order to do a form of critical commentary on their own. So we have, and what I try to do in the book is really treat musical composition as a form of ethnography, as a form of scholarship in itself, and look at Zayn as, Zayn and the other Indian taarab performers that I focus on as intellectuals who are working in a different medium than prose, sometimes working in poetry, but working in sound. Actually, there's a whole section of that Zayn chapter, like that's just as long as the Zayn chapter, that I cut out, like maybe 3 months before I finished the manuscript. I finally realized, after spending so much time on it, that it wasn't going to go in the book. And finally, I cite it as a manuscript in progress there. And I had to work with an Arab music specialist to really fine tune it, because it's tons of transcriptions of what he was doing with musical sound in a specific kind of experiment that he was undertaking. And so he was developing a theory of maqam, theory of Swahili maqam. I felt it belonged in the book for a long time, and then I realized it was just another register, a lot of transcription. It belongs more in like a music theory journal instead. But really, the argument that I make there much more even directly, or I think I make it directly in certain places in the book, but in that is I start out with, he's a music theorist. This is what he's doing, but he's doing it through composition. And he's, there was at the same time in the 1970s, there was the Reverend A.M. Jones was writing, transcriptions of Swahili music and talking about Swahili approach to maqam. And he was doing that in journals, but he never stepped foot in Mombasa, never stepped foot on the Swahili coast. And here was Zayn and Sheikh Nabhani sitting down at the same time and composing as music theory. And so that's, I really like to think that I'm, as much as possible in this book, writing with these musicians, rather than just writing about them. I think I'll open it to questions, or at least bring my comments to a close.
Thank you very much. Yeah. Could I have anybody wants to ask any question? Yes. Maybe just introduce it. I mean, so say
Yeah,
who
please.
you are, and then
My name is student at SOAS and study migration studies. My question picks up more of a sociopolitical aspect. I was just wondering if you had the chance to draw any observations from female artists, because I think taarab grew to include women largely ever since the 1930s, with Siti's popularization of Mpogwa Gahande and then later Wikileaks. I think it's coming from the coast of Tanzania, it's really difficult to separate the two, taarab and the woman, because it's become such a symbol of female emancipation ever since Siti, which is a household figure in Taarab. So I think
Yeah.
Can I quickly add
Yeah,
to
go ahead.
this? Maybe if you also
Go ahead.
expand this, because in your book, you also talk about the other cities. There is women in Mombasa who call themselves City something. And I think
City
there's
Ganduri.
almost like an homage
Mhm.
to City Binti Saad. So if you could just talk about that as well.
Yeah.
Sorry, I jumped on your question.
No, there's, I mean, there's definitely a sort of, in the book, a kind of more of a focus on male musicians. And partly because, you know, and I explore this question also, you know, this is the specific, because I don't see it as a history of Taarab. I mean, I sat with Malika, who was visiting Abu Dhabi, who's a very well-known Taarab singer from the 90s. I mean, well, she left in the 90s, but she had this huge national hit in the 90s in Kenya. She's from Somalia, but she lives in the US, and she was in Abu Dhabi with family, and I sat with her and looked at the book. And I you know, I wanted to explain to her, like, you know, if this was a history of Taarab, there'd be a chapter on you. Instead, you're talked about in the Zayn chapter, but that's because it's a history of a cultural practice of the transoceanic appropriation, which is something she did. And I discuss her in the, you know, in various places, including the epilogue. I talk about one of her works. But Siti Binti Saad, there's a chapter on Akina Siti Binti Saad, Siti Binti Saad's collective. And taking a lot from, you know, Zayn, the way he described their work, you know, I focus on them as composers, including Siti, and it was understood, you know, among Zayn that she, you know, she was just as much a composer of these settings as the others, even though, like, she's singing and they're playing instruments, so you might sort of think, oh, they're the ones composing the settings, but they were all collaborating. So Siti Binti Saad is where sort of this cultural practice starts. And there's a really important input from Sheikh Mbaruk, who was the Mombasan member. Whether that's why it gets taken up in Mombasa more, but I think it's part of the story. But the argument I make is that Mombasa is where, like, there is a kind of compulsion to reflect on these different you know, connections and on Swahili identity, and it becomes taken up through music. So Siti Binti Saad, you know, there are one other Siti that I analyzed some of her work, is Siti Ganduri, who had a bit of a kind of revival in the 50s. She was sort of at, you know, at the end of her career then, but she was recording. So there's not as much focus on female icons, that well, there's no, you know, not nearly as much as it would be if this was a proper history of Taarab and Mombasa, where there would be, you know, it would be completely different in terms of the focus. But so the specific question was about it, Taarab as a site of female emancipation. Yeah, it's not something that I really delve into. I think it's kind of like, you know, I tell that part of the story with Siti, but others like Laura Fair have told it better. And what I want to talk about is her approach to composition with her collaborators, and especially the use of comedy as a kind of underlying kind of ground, or as a kind of groundwork on which they're building. And so everything they're doing is sort of comedic, and that sets up a kind of sense that there's always some sort of hidden meaning in everything they do, not just in the lyrics, in the mafumbo, in the metaphors, but also in the music. And they're very, very intentional about what they're taking and what they're putting together. So yeah, that's my approach there.
Yeah, my name is Murat Nurius. I previously worked with the Qatar Digital Library,
Yes,
British
of
Library,
course, yeah.
On Gulf recordings.
Yeah, I've read your
different
posts. Yeah.
And I just came back from a research trip in East Africa. My research regarding the person contemporary Taarab. I met, for instance, Africa.
Well, that's Mbaraka Monate, who were with me last week. Yeah.
And I sat with them, and they were complaining bitterly that actually taarab is the past, and
Yeah.
nobody is nobody's interested anymore, because on the weddings they prefer the DJ rather than the bands here.
Right.
And also the museums. My work was actually with the local museums, and all the museums. They wanted to inviting them to perform, and they want to perform. So how's the situation right now? So it's
it's very difficult. And I mean, Mbarak he says that Lelele Africa is the only group in Mombasa that's using, he calls them ala zabaridi, the cold instruments, in other words, non-electric instruments. I found that metaphor really interesting. But yeah, and he plays harmonium, and he's picked up the tashkota, which was a traditional Mombasa instrument, which is a Japanese toy koto. And he picked that up because no one else was playing it anymore. And it's a big struggle. He has done some good work with Ketable Music in Nairobi, and I wasn't the one who introduced them, which is interesting because I know I spent a lot of time with Ketable Music, which is an NGO in Nairobi, and they're interested in preserving sort of indigenous popular traditions of music. But organically they just got to know each other, and so they worked together a bit. So and I've been recently doing some work with Mbarak. This is the second time I brought him to Abu Dhabi for a project. The first time he was playing with Ghazi Malefi's Boom Diwan group. It's been a struggle. It was a struggle 20 years ago, when this group first came together under a different name. Basically, I was there, and I was trying to help them with promotional materials and such. And it's a struggle. And then there's internal dynamics and controversies that come because there's, it's a very difficult thing what they're trying to do. For a brief time, they had some work with Werner Graebner, who's sort of retired from this, but he was doing a lot of, work on, he produced a lot of recordings of taarab, including recordings of Zain Labdin. But yeah, it's very difficult. And I write about the heritageization. I write about it better than I speak about it, I guess. And that's sort of one avenue for taarab, but it's been kind of more productive, more successful for musicians in Zanzibar. And Mombasa, it's like a direction that is there, but it's not. So even that, like as taarab as heritage music, I think Lelele Africa are doing it as well as you can do it, and they still don't have the opportunities. So it's a big problem.
Yeah. Hi, I'm Sophie. I'm a postdoc in the music department at King's. Thank you so much. I can't wait to read it. I have a couple of questions. One, I guess, it comes from personal interest. I work on Egyptian music, so I'm wondering if there are kind of continuing connections to Egypt, whether they're kind of limited to this heritage version, or whether people are influenced by newer styles. And I'm also wondering, the panelists mentioned that, the really rich kind of ethnographic detail of your book, as well as the really valuable kind of musical analysis. So I wondered about how that came together when you were doing research and also turning it into the book. Because it's kind of hard to put that together sometimes. And you mentioned that you had to kind of cut this section because it all worked better in a music analysis journal. So I wonder how you kind of navigated that.
Yeah, on Egypt, I mean, so the Egyptian connection is always much stronger in Zanzibar, and that's sort of, one of the kind of differences. But of course, Egyptian music is also an incredibly important influence in Mombasa and taarab as well. In terms of continuing connections, there is an interesting story of the Dow Countries Music Academy in Zanzibar, where it was started with a Ford Foundation grant, and one of the activities to sort of get it started was to send some of the teachers to be trained in Egypt. So to like reestablish that kind of connection. So I think, so there's always been a kind of stronger, but it's interesting, you go back to the 19th century and you have this sense that, well, it's not a sense, but you have this the fact that you had Egyptian musicians either working in the court, or it's unclear whether they're working in the court or just trained people who trained musicians who played for the Busaidi court in the 19th century, and the Lamu-based or Northern Kenya coast-based, like Muhammadi Kijuma, who was a well-known poet and musician, went to the court, and he sort of introduced them to something very different. It was understood that like the Lamu tradition was just as distinguished, but it had different influences. So it's probably more Yemeni, more Kuwaiti. And so he had a different understanding of maqam, of like, you know, the little that's there in terms of like historical documents about sound and melody and these kind of little tidbits that you can find in the historical records suggest that he was sort of learning this Egyptian stuff himself when he was there and teaching musicians there something new. So there's always been this difference between the Kenyan coast and Zanzibar with respect to Egyptian influences. But of course, because Cairo then becomes this really important center for recording industry and the influence of, I mean, Zayn, I document, I mean, he borrowed a lot of melodies from Kulthum, and he modeled himself on Farid al-Atrash. So the Egyptian influence is also strong. As for like methodologically kind of approaching, so the main body of research that the book is based on was ethnographic research, where I wasn't thinking I was doing a historical work. And I still don't think it's history, it's genealogy. But so that's like sort of the kind of the material I was working with, and the questions I ask in my dissertation, even though some of the material finds its way into the book, the framing is different. And there's a whole section of the dissertation that's about the Islamic soundscape in Mombasa, and some of that it's not in the book, but it's sort of referenced in the book, that work, because it's work that I continued doing. So when I came to this, you know, there was a question of whether I have the material to do it, whether I'm enough of a historian to do this project the way I wrote it. And first of all, you know, kind of doing kind of cultural history or genealogy, you know, but not being an historian, I mean, it's going to be a different kind of thing. But I also, in the intervening years, there was like the chapter on Satyam Vita, which was really important. And in terms of the historiographical kind of approach in there, I could only do that because James Brennan, the historian, had done a lot of work already. He and I were in Mombasa together, and even some of his key interviews, we were there together, actually. I introduced him to some of his interlocutors. But I was interested in Satyam Vita, but it was so background. There were too many things that I was focusing on that were very much of that moment, and I couldn't stretch myself that far. So Jim and I we continued to share materials. We were doing a little bit of work in the local newspaper, like you know, like sharing these materials, and he was able to sort of write this history of Satyam Vita that I could then use as a launchpad to focus on specific aspects. So it needed the time, maybe, you know, probably like 15 years earlier, I couldn't have written the book that way because I didn't have, you know, the other material to work with. But I also ended up, you know, falling into this kind of approach where I was using a lot of what was ethnographic work in 2005 to 2006, 2004 to 2006, where I really, you know, I kind of realized later after I'd done a lot of work that I was doing a lot of oral history. That's really what I was doing. I was thinking of it as ethnography, but it ended up being all history. And also interacting with musicians, that ethnographic work then allowed me to understand and to convey a little bit of what goes on in performance and reception. And so I have sort of ethnographic descriptions that are, you know, I open a lot of the chapters with an ethnographic vignette, even though it's about decades earlier. So it's sort of, it's a messy process. I guess that's this.
Doesn't come across as it.
Yeah, we probably have one question, and then we might have to leave the room. Please, man.
My name is Yondo. I'm a Portuguese and Swahili interpreter. Just for my understanding, so we have an Indian taarab and Arabic taarab. Now, how does this Swahili, I mean, the influences of this, how does it contribute? How does the uniqueness of this Swahili contributed by the Indian Taarab and the Arabic Taarab?
Yeah. First of all, I'll say I use the term Arab Taarab, but like advisedly in the sense that, well, first of all, there is a history of Taarab being sung in Arabic. And Tarabia, Kiarabu, I mean, it can mean like, if you say Arabic Taarab, it can be translated like that, meaning like Taarab sung in Arabic. But I'm real, I needed to sort of distinguish it. That's why I use Arab Taarab, and it's really about Arabness and it's about Arab style. And so the same way that, we often say Arab music, although some people say Arabic music. But I translate it that way advisedly, even though, and I mentioned in a footnote, in earlier publications, I had also translated it as Arabic Taarab. But to actually answer your question, so these are kind of subgenres that, I mean, one of the reasons why it's hard to like know about, so I'm sure you knew Juma Balo, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like I hadn't conceptualized it
Right.
as Indian Taarab.
And that's, especially, coming at it from outside Mombasa, it makes sense. But even Mombasans might not realize that Juma Balo is not sort of sui generis, like that. There's actually a longer history, and it really is a kind of subgenre in the sense that there's specific approaches, not just borrowing Bollywood melodies, which is done outside of Indian Taarab as well. By Zanzibari, Tanzanian, and Mombasan artists. So-called modern Taarab also borrows Bollywood melodies. So borrowing a Bollywood melody itself doesn't make it Indian Taarab, although it aligns it with Indian Taarab. Indian Taarab is a historical phenomenon that starts in the 1930s, and there are musicians who, mostly men, actually all men really, the singers, although there are female singers who borrow Indian melodies and maybe even bring in a bit of like the Asha Bhosle, or bring in a bit of the style. But the Indian Taarab subgenre, these are singers who only sing in Indian style. They cultivate an Indian style of singing. That's the way they sing, only in this Indian style and only on Indian melodies. And also the accompaniment is, has specific aspects of Indian style built into it. And this goes back to the 30s. And then I identify, but even by the time I was working in, 2005, a lot of people, even, people who were of a relatively older generation there, weren't aware of the depth of this history and how it really is a kind of coherent subgenre. And you have these two pathways. You can be the Indian Taarab professor like Juma Balo, or you can be the Indian Taarab clown like Musa Maruf. And there were two different approaches to the genre. But of course, my interlocutors like Zain and people around him said, this is Tarabiya ki Hindi, like they were very clear that this is a specific subgenre, but not everyone was aware of that. They would be aware of Juma Balo. They weren't aware that there was a whole kind of history behind that. And Arab Taarab really was like centered on Zain. He wasn't the only one who did it, but he was, there was a couple of actually other Yemeni, like Hadramis, and Zain competed with them for Hadrami weddings that he would play. And Zain was the outsider because he was from a Yemeni clan, but he was not Hadrami. And I go through this, like what makes it that he's not Hadrami? It's because it's a specific class identity also. There were some Hadramis who also were native Swahili speakers who also performed Arab Taarab as well. But it really, like Zain was the dominant figure in that. And when he passed away, even before he passed away, the genre had really dissipated, it was really gone. Even by 2005, when he was performing at what was a very traditional type of event that I was able to film. And that was the only one of those that happened in the 2 years that I spent in his orbit in Mombasa. Not his only performance, but the only really men's Taarab event that was kind of, that they approached it in a very traditional way. Other events were at cultural festivals or at these beach hotels where he was presented as like the kind of Swahili Arabic kind of, ambiance. I played with him at some of these. There was one really strange moment when a European tourist came up to me because he probably thought I was like the manager of the group because I was the white guy. And asking me to translate this ring he had in Arabic. So I was like, well, okay. And I gave it to a member of the group who had spent time in Saudi. I was like, he probably could, Zain could also read Arabic, but, you know, and he looked at me like, the tourist looked at me like I didn't understand him, because the guy I was handing it to was the darkest skinned man there, and but he's fluent in Arabic, I'm not, So yeah, those were like some of the oddest experiences I had playing at these beach hotels, but it gave him some sort of income, and there was, we backed up belly dancers at some point at these beach hotels. It was like really kind of crazy. So anyway, sorry, that was an aside, but Arab taarab and Indian taarab, these recognized subgenres that kind of don't exist anymore. But there's also, there are two strands within, and I explain it this way, talk about the kind of Bahari taarab in Mombasa, this kind of, there were there's much more than that, right? But these are like two case studies of specific sort of coherent subgenres within this much broader sea of taarab.
Well, everybody, thank you so much for coming. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please feel free to come and buy a book and take a photo and have your book signed. Also, for those who are interested in music, we have an event on the 13th of March, where we have an Ethiopian classical pianist called Jirma Yifrasho. He'll be playing the piano for us and talking about Ethiopian classical music. So 13th of March, come join us again. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah.
Is somebody taking money from don't know how to clean it.
So I'm going to attach.
Cash. What is the money?
You know what? You want cash, but okay, fine.